is it right? Is it just to ask young women of childbearing age who are most at risk from nutrient deficiencies at this period of their lives, is it right to ask them to do without animal source foods? At what point does that become immoral? Because even Eat Lancet, which is the organization that you may know about, who's pushing for the plant-based diet around the world, and for the past 5 years has been doing so. In its original report, even they said that their diet, which is about half an ounce of meat a day, it's so nearly vegan, and it really downplays the importance of dairy and eggs and any animal foods. Even they admit that that diet is not suitable for babies, children, toddlers, teenagers, young women of childbearing age, pregnant women, ill people, old people. So this is, again, the fine print. And I just do not understand how anyone can hold up that diet as the best diet if that is true. It's not right. It is immoral to do that.
Jayne Buxton, this is such a pleasure. Welcome to the Your Body's Way podcast. I'm so happy to have you on this call. And as we were just discussing just now, you weren't easy to get hold of. So I'm really glad that we finally get to have this conversation. We are going to dive in to your book today. I believe it's from 2023, right? I forgot to double check the date. Was it 2022?
Actually, the hardback was 2022, and the paperback was 2023. So it's always a year later. So the paperback only just come out.
Okay, wow, congratulations. Yeah. The Great Plant-Based Con. I've got the Kindle version because I do everything on Kindle, and because I'm in Cayman Islands, it's not easy for me to receive books. But I have to say, this is an absolutely fabulous book. I've been really enjoying reading it. I would describe it as controversial. I explain it as humorous at times, really informative, and just perfect for the layperson, like somebody who's just interested in this topic and just wants to learn more. And I think you capture that really, really well. So I can't wait to dive into this book and to speak to you about it rather than just reading the words on the page. I can't wait to actually hear what you have to say about it. But first of all, you're in Wiltshire, you said. So how are things over there? How's the weather, by the way?
Well, today it's really sunny, so it's absolutely wonderful, beautiful. And yesterday it was pouring with rain. You never know what you're going to get, but it is truly lovely out here, and it's a new thing for me. We've only been here 8 months, and I'm a pretty urban girl, so I'm used to London and that kind of environment. And this has all just been a whole assault on the senses for us living here. I've got ducks outside on my pond and deer in the field, and everywhere, the most beautiful countryside. Farming is very big around here, so it's been very good for me to connect with people who are actually doing a lot of the stuff I write about in the book. So it's been professionally and personally a very, very good thing.
Yeah, because in cities, it's difficult to be in touch with nature and to try and get hold of the types of foods that we speak about and that we advocate for people, and that we that we think is the best for our health. It's really difficult, but I understand when you say you're an urban girl, because I am too. But it's really interesting because this just came to mind. We were talking about your blog, The Diary of a Legal Alien. And I have to say, when I was first researching you, I came across that blog and it was fantastic. It's a very humorous blog about you living in New York. So you're one hell of an urban girl, like London, New York. How was that? Because I freaking love New York. Like, how was it actually living there though?
It was amazing. Again, a total shock to the senses. I remember the first night we got there, the first night in our apartment, we lay awake, and literally there was a cacophony of noise all night long, literally till 5 a.m, and then starts again at 6. Sirens, honking horns, people shouting in the street, just so much. And we looked at each other, we thought, what are we're never going to be able to sleep here. How do people live here? Well, within a week, it was just background. Within a week, we were so used to it. So New York is really vibrant and loud and intense, and everything is available. Everything's on your doorstep.
That's what I love.
And
Yeah.
it's completely different from where I live now. So I do feel like we've had the most extreme experiences of both kind, you know, which is great. But it was only for a year. And so it was, I really just embraced it. And I wrote that blog really as much for myself so I could remember what it felt like, every new thing that we were experiencing.
But I love that because you know, this kind of goes back to what you do, and you are an author, an incredibly successful author. And I noticed that you have a master's in creative writing, which is just fabulous. I mean, you know, when you always, you know, I don't know if you have this, but I think most people have this, when they wish they could go back in time and they could kind of do something a little bit different. And I always think, gosh, you know, I wish I studied like English, creative writing. I wish I went down that road as just because it's one of my interests, like writing. But I've never been I've never been like, I'm an okay writer, but you know, I don't have those skills that someone who's trained has. And
you might do.
maybe, but I can imagine with your book, The Great Plant-Based Con. I mean, you've got 4 books under your belt, I presume.
Yeah, and 2 are fiction and 2 are nonfiction. And so again, there's that sort of, there are a lot of different things in my life. And you know, I started out as a management consultant and I did an MBA, and an MBA cannot be more different to a master's in creative writing in many ways, you know. One is all about data, analysis, hard facts, logic. That's what you're trained to look at, and you're trained to apply that to client situations in the work. Creative writing is about, yes, it's about technique, and that's what I went, because I wanted to master technique, deep technique, but it's also about opening your mind, unblocking imagination, creativity. It's about really nurturing those things in yourself. So at first glance, they look like 2 separate ways of thinking and separate skill sets, but I found that they were really helpful, both sets, when I was writing this particular book.
I was going to say,
because I had to learn to analyze data, studies, scientific studies that, apologies, that's my dog barking.
That's okay.
Scientific studies, which I hadn't looked at before. So there's a certain training of the mind that you have to go through. At the same time, I had to figure out how to tell a story in a way that would reach lay people and also keep it interesting for 500 pages.
Right.
So I do think that both things helped me a lot in writing this book, although it's quite amazing what you will get critiqued for out there in the world of social media if people want to slam you down. So a lot of people who take against my message, vegan advocates, plant-based supporters, the first thing they go for usually is, oh, she's only got a master's in creative writing. What would she possibly know? Right? She's writing fiction. They love that one. They love to say that I must be writing fiction like some of my novels. So you just have to put up with that. I know deep down that both of those skills were necessary for reaching people with a message. So that's I mean,
that's a really interesting point, though. Like, how do you come back? I mean, I know that you don't necessarily respond. You probably don't respond to these people, but how would you respond to that if someone was to say, "Oh, she's just an author. She's just a writer. Like, what does she know?" Like, what would you say to that?
Well, I think I would say, first of all, that authors, since the dawn of time, whether they be investigative writers, investigative journalists, or whatever form that writing takes, they, since the dawn of time, have been looking at areas of interest, areas of concern, and they are rarely specialists in those areas, but they want to uncover information. So that's what we do.
Yeah.
And I'm not ashamed to say that I did it in an area that I wasn't previously a specialist in, that a lot of authors do that. Nobody seems to mind when Bill Bryson does that. He writes about the body or the house or history or the history of walking in fields and nature, right? Bill Bryson. Everybody picks up his
Right.
books, and they love to read them because
Yeah.
it's something new that he has researched.
Yeah. My husband's a big fan. Yeah.
Right. And so there's that side. And then the other thing I would say is, yes, I proudly am a fiction writer and somebody who studies creative writing, because communication of ideas is just as important as the ideas themselves. And I wanted to be able to do that, and I still want to do that as effectively as possible. So, if I ever were to, as you say, get into a debate with one of those people, that's what I would say. But I generally just sort of let it ride, because
Yeah.
there's absolutely no point in having those discussions.
Yeah. But I have to say, Jayne, you have to be a pretty strong woman, because to go to disagree with a movement like,
Mhm.
plant-based diets, whatever you want to call it, meat-free, veganism, vegetarianism, it's got so much power behind it. It's got the governments, health professionals, and the public, like, all rallying behind it, saying it's better for the environment, it's better for our health. How could you not go meat free?
Mm.
It's you've got to have some thick skin to
Yeah,
actually disagree with that and say, well, actually, it's not good for the environment and it's not good for your health. So, I mean, that kind of leads me to my first question. Like, how do you deal with that yourself? Like, do you block out criticism? Because I imagine you have a lot of support as well.
I do.
Like, you
I
have,
do.
and I can imagine that's part of what fuels
Mm.
you and keeps you going.
Mhm.
But I mean, have you managed a way to kind of filter out that criticism? And I mean, I've read a few things online
Mm.
that I came across regarding some of your interviews and blogs, and some of the terms people use they're pretty vile. Like, I
Yeah.
just wonder how you deal with that. Like, do you just have a very thick skin, or have you just got to?
No, I have just had to learn. I'm actually quite a sensitive person, and my husband, my kids, friends, they all warned me that I would face this. I knew I was going to. In fact, some friends said, "Why on earth are you writing this book? You're absolutely crazy. Why would you invite this into your life at this stage?" So I knew what I was sort of getting into. I guess I didn't realize just how mean-spirited it could all be. So the kind of things that you're referring to, I probably haven't seen all of what you have seen. I can imagine the vile terms, but I do block that out. I don't go online searching for what people are saying. Occasionally enters my arena because somebody sends it to me,
Yeah,
or
and
it's
it's just
on
there.
Twitter and I just see it. Um, but I don't look for it, and I try not to get upset about it. I remember when the book first came out, there was immediately, it was reported in our Daily Telegraph here, and there was a big 3-page spread on it. And it invited a big pushback from the vegan community, and it was very organized. It was vegan advocacy groups, such as Sentient Media, who just targeted me with a barrage of information saying I was lying, it was false, and didn't I know this and didn't I know that. They not only did that, they did a targeted attack on anyone who was quoted in my book and anyone who had supported me by promoting the book. So that was interesting, because they stirred up a whole maelstrom of support for me, really, amongst those people. Every one of those scientists came back and fought back with information and supported me. So while I felt attacked, I also felt supported.
Yeah.
There is a massive community out there that has supported me, and 90% of my interactions are with people who are sympathetic or at least open-minded. One very awful period was last Christmas, about a year ago, just before Christmas, actually. And there was a couple of vegan activist people who were having a debate, and one of them was a doctor who was pretty high up in one of a big hospitals in America. And they went across, they crossed a line, and their attacks were misogynistic and sexual in nature, and vile, absolutely vile. And again, the outpouring of support for me and people therefore refuting what they were doing was huge. So although I felt fairly shocked by it, and obviously you get not hurt, but you feel very vulnerable. Although that happened, I also felt the opposite. And, it was quite amusing actually in the end, because one of the doctor was so worried about what he had said and how it might impact his career, because I threatened to report him to the dean of his medical school.
Right.
And he begged me not to. I mean, he DM'd me for weeks.
Wow.
Please don't. And I said, okay, you're gonna write an online apology, and here's what it's gonna say. And so he did that. And then that sort of backfired a little bit, because people were saying, oh, what a nice guy, he's written this great apology. And I was thinking, okay,
But still, like, you know
I
better,
made
and
him
he knows.
Yeah, he knows.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter what your view is, because we all have freedom to have our views. You just don't have to say it in that way. I mean, what I love about your book, The Great Plant-Based Con, which I'd recommend to anybody who's interested in this topic, I love how you start the book. You basically say, look, I'm not judging anybody who chooses to eat meat-free, plant-based, vegan, vegetarian, and who it's just their choice. Like, they're just doing it, like minding their own business. This is my choice. I don't want to eat meat because of this, because of that. You're not judging those people, and you're not telling them to change. You're basically saying you're addressing the plant-based advocates, which you describe as the people who are pushing their agenda, the plant-based agenda, onto people and making people think that it's better for the environment and better for their health. And really the book is targeted at that. And I really like that, because that's you kind of took you kind of represented myself and anybody else who feels the same. Even putting out episodes like this on my podcast, I know vegans. I'm friends with them, and I want to make it really clear all the time that when I put out episodes like this, I'm not attacking them, and I'm not telling them to change, and I'm just no judgment whatsoever. But we're just talking about a topic that is out there, and that is that plant-based diets have been quite heavily pushed by the powers that be. And maybe they don't have our best interests at heart, which is something that you refer to in the book. That I hope to talk about later. So, I mean, your book takes us through 4 main sections. The first one is plant-based good for our health? That's, first basic question. Second is, will a plant-based diet save the planet? Another good question. Who is advocating for the plant-based diet and why? And how should we eat? So those are the 4 main sections. And, that's kind of what I want to kind of go into today. So first of all, the first question, I mean, this might require a long answer.
It may.
It may
down
do.
if I go on too much.
Because there's lots of different ways that you can answer this, and I honestly don't mind any way you want to answer this. But Jayne, is plant-based eating good for our health? So I'll let you take this wherever you want.
Okay. So that's the whole of section 1.
It is whole of section. That's a lot of section 1. Yeah.
And I guess to start with, I would say eating plants can be good for us, and it even a mainly plant-based diet can suit some people.
Okay, good.
So, and it can suit some people at certain times in their lives if they're trying to deal with a certain condition or a certain mood disorder or whatever. But what, as you quite rightly pointed out, what I object to is the idea that plant-based diets, as in those without any animal source foods at all, or with such minimal amounts that they're negligible. I object to the idea that those are universally good for people, good for everyone. Now, it used to be that we had a great acceptance of the idea that there was no one-size-all-fits diet, right? Because we acknowledge that there are cultural differences, there are differences of geography and availability, historical differences, income differences, genetic differences, which mean you can't, some people can't eat certain types of foods. So we've been able to acknowledge that there are many diets in the world that serve many purposes for people. Now suddenly we're supposed to believe that a plant-based diet is the one for everyone around the world. So that is what to me is just a ridiculous concept. Now, what I go through in that part is, okay, why is it not ideal for everyone?
Yeah.
First of all, the number one reason is the nutrient reason. So there is a lack of certain nutrients and a shortage of other nutrients in a diet which is plant-based. So for instance, B12 is something that everybody seems to know about, and it's the first thing that vegans fight back on, because they say, well, it doesn't matter, you can get B12 from a pill.
A very common supplement, very common supplement, yeah.
And I would ask them to think, okay, well, that is true. Let's set aside the fact that supplemented vitamins are not always absorbed in the same way as with food. Let's look at the question of, if we were meant to eat this way, if it really was the best way for us, why would that diet be short of B12 then? How do we explain that? And it's also short of several other vitamins. And when people talk about a well-planned, well-balanced vegan diet, they seem to be saying a diet where people are very on the ball, they know what they need, and they get whatever they can't get from food, they get it from pills. That seems, so are we really advocating for a diet based on pills versus food when we're advocating for a well-balanced vegan diet? So, those nutrients, what are those nutrients that are missing? Well, B12 is one, D3, vitamin A, zinc, iodine, glycine, choline, vitamin K. All of these are either absent or in short supply in diets which have no animal source foods. And then we have the whole question of bioavailability, which is really something, it's kind of the elephant in the room that nobody seems to write about. I rarely see, online stuff or thought pieces in newspapers that even mention bioavailability. So what does it mean? I'm sure your listeners are pretty au fait with what it means, but just for clarity, it means the extent to which our body can use the vitamins or the minerals which we're getting from the food. And it remains a fact that the vitamins from animal source foods are vastly more bioavailable. So, you can get vitamin A from in beta carotene form, of which I think we absorb about 12%, or you can get the real vitamin A from animal source foods, and your absorption level is going to be in the 80s and 90%. So this is true across the board. It's true of D3 versus D2. So D3 is the animal sourced version of the vitamin versus D2, which is the plant source. It's true of minerals like iron. So I read this brilliant article recently by Lily Nichols, who put in, and she's an RD, you may have interviewed her. She specializes in nutrition for pregnancy. She's really good. Yeah, good to interview, good for anyone who's pregnant to get her book immediately. And she did an analysis of how much plant food versus animal food you'd have to eat to get the same amount of bioavailable iron. And one of the comparisons was you could eat 1 3-ounce chicken thigh or 57 cups of broccoli. So this is repeated with many different foods. It's the same if you want to get all of your amino acids from plants. You could eat a kilo of quinoa or 3 ounces of beef. Right. So this is
sorry. There's this part that just kind of reminded me. There's this part in your book when you talk about protein, and you talk about how much food we'd need to eat if we wanted 45 grams of protein. Now, the reason why this caught my attention was because your probably aware, or maybe not, of the trend. Well, it's I don't know what to call it, but everyone's very aware now that 30 grams of protein per meal is
Right,
like
that's a new
optimal.
thing. Yeah.
That's optimal, like, and it's become very like popular in the health space. And it just seems to be what everybody's recommending now. Like everyone's jumping on the bandwagon, like 30
Yeah.
grams of protein per meal. And that's why this gripped my attention when you said that 45 grams of protein. If you were on a plant-based diet, you would need to have 100 grams of brown rice or kidney beans or tofu or cashew nuts. And 100 grams that's a huge, that's
Actually,
a
it might have
lot.
been 1,000 actually, because 100 grams
1,000.
is small, but 1,000 is what you usually have to have of these
1,000.
things.
Oh
A whole,
God, I need to look
whole
back at the book.
I mean,
Yeah.
I
Maybe
haven't
it was
got that
100 grams of
open either.
carbs. Maybe I was getting it mixed up with 100 grams
That's
of
exactly
carbs.
right.
Yeah, that's
This
right.
is the
Yes.
point. To
Yes.
get all of your protein, the requisite protein, you probably have to really up your carb intake. And
Yeah.
that's going to be problematic for anyone who's got a propensity to diabetes or weight gain. So yes, it can be done. And boy, are you going to feel full. You are
Yeah.
going to be bloated as anything. I mean, this is something which is rarely acknowledged, but if it is 30 grams of protein per meal, which is advisable, and I've read that too, and I also know that a lot of protein specialists say that none of us get nearly enough.
Yeah.
This 0.8 grams per kilo of body weight
The
recommended by the
recommendation
WHO is really not enough for young developing bodies, or for the elderly. For the part. So it's very hard. I mean, 30 grams of protein at breakfast, for instance, you have to eat quite a few eggs. But if you're not having any of the eggs, you are, you're going to be hard pressed with your oatmeal and your fruit to get that.
Yeah. Do you think that we are too soft on the issues with veganism? So in the first section of your book, you talk about how health professionals and those advocating the vegan diet, vegetarianism, they promote all of the great things about them, but then in the small print they say, but you may need to supplement. Especially for pregnant women, especially for children, and anyone growing or needing to recovering, or that it's kind of the fine print. And you mentioned in the first part that you said we're too soft-footed, we're too soft with these advocates. So explain what you mean by that. Like, what do you mean by we're being too soft with them?
Well, we're aiming most of the time to be diplomatic, when I say we, I mean, say your average doctor who's asked to comment on this on morning TV, or the average writer in a mainstream newspaper. They are soft-footed because they don't want to offend.
Yeah.
And because I guess it's drummed into them, you've always got to have two sides to the story. Now, this desire not to offend doesn't just pertain to veganism and diet. It pertains to just about everything we discuss these days. You can't say it like it is. You cannot have a firm opinion on one side or the other unless it's the popular side. And you're allowed to have it. And I'm not going to bring up what those debates are, but I think we all know what they are. There are several of them floating around, whereby we are very soft-footed about, I'm very careful about offending the mainstream narrative. So I think I quoted one example where on breakfast TV, again, there was an interview, and it was about a new study that had come out that showed that vegans have 2.5 times the level of fracture, bone fractures like hips and ankles, to omnivores. And they were questioning, why might this be? And this was a perfect opportunity to talk about nutrients, to talk about the fact that, yes, you can, if you want to, eat vegan diets for the reason, for whatever reason you want, but you need to be really careful about the supplementation, or you need to be aware that these are the risks you are taking with your body. Instead of doing that, they brought on a doctor who didn't want to offend and who said, oh, I don't know. Vegans are pretty clued up about what they need. I think you can, for instance, if you want to get the calcium and the iron and the B12, eat broccoli. And this is just false information, because it's so impossible, as we've just discussed, to get the amount of nutrients that you need from those foods. It's just irresponsible. So at what point does irresponsibility cross over into kind of almost a criminality? Like, it's really very harmful. And I think Paul Mason does a great video, and he just put it out on YouTube. I encourage anyone to look for him. Just Google Paul Mason on veganism. And he said that actually promoting, I forget what his words were, but he said promoting vegan diets as a good source of iron, for instance, and he only picked that one, and he just discussed others, but this one is actually criminal. It's a criminal offense, because how can you promote it when you know you can't get very much iron in a world where there are 2 billion people who are iron deficient,
right,
and in a world where chronic shortages of iron and pernicious anemia from B12 shortages can actually kill you, right? So he's not being soft-footed. He's stating it like it is. He's saying, let's face some facts here about what these nutrients do for us and what the shortage will also do to us.
right.
Right. And I would love to see people just talking about facts. You don't have to have a screaming row on television or in a newspaper or on a podcast. You don't have to have that. You just have to have the facts stood up against one another.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I always admire people who, stick their neck out and just say it as it is, because, even myself, okay, so I put out podcasts like this, and that kind of by default tells my view on things. But, the thought of me directly putting it in a post, I just wouldn't because I don't want to put my neck out there. I don't want to say anything that's going to offend anyone. And, and that's something that I need to kind of, face and kind of have to deal with. And I think a lot of people feel the same, because it's, it can be with social media now. It's frightening. It's a frightening world when everyone can say anything they want. I mean, I've put out a few controversial episodes in the past. One was about oxalates, which I know you mentioned in your book, and which I want to discuss actually after this. Another one was about the foods that cause disease, like flour, sugar, and vegetable oils. And gosh, the some of those posts have kind of gone viral, and the comments you get in response is literally swearing, attacking you personally, and attacking your attacking background, attacking looks, attacking the way you speak. And it's scary. And it's so you just end up saying nothing. And I can imagine, that's why it's so difficult for people to just say as it is. And, the plant-based world is a very powerful one. It's got a lot of backing, and also because it's got so many important issues that it uses as part of its weaponry. So environment, climate change, how can anybody who hasn't read up on it, how can anybody go against that and say, well, no, I don't agree. This is climate change. This is your children. This is the future generations. It's so sensitive and it's so visceral. And people just don't want to people don't want to do it. They don't want to go against it. So anybody like yourself, or you just said, Paul Mason, people just speaking out, I'm just gosh, well done.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to do that, and then you step back, because
you're just okay, I'm done.
I'm sure, I'm so sorry if you've had those kind of comments. They are not very nice. They are not nice, and they make you question what you're doing. But then, if you wake up the next day and you realize you have to keep going, you have to fight for, if not the truth, because I know a lot of people would say, well, you're not the only person with the truth. we have to fight for at least the ability to put an alternative point of view and to have people understand it and decide for themselves. That's all I'm asking for, really. It's for people to look at this information and decide whether it's plausible, whether it's convincing, and what might be the questions that they could ask of plant-based advocates themselves in order to get to grips with the issue of what they should eat.
Yeah.
But it is so amazing that, you receive, very hurtful and aggressive treatment for talking about food, for talking about vegetable oils or flour, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have to stop and think, well, how did we get here that food has become this political weapon?
It's a weapon. Yeah, it's I mean, like you said in the book, when it comes to the environment piece, or I can't remember which section it was, you mentioned how the bigger powers, like the governments, they want to use the food, the meat production as an excuse for climate change, because they'd rather you focus on that rather than fossil fuels, which is big money, like plane trips and cars, and there's just more money in protecting that. So they'd rather go with the plant-based kind of route, and there's money to be made there, like you said, lab-based meats, and like there's a lot of money to be made if people go plant-based. So I mean, your view is really interesting, because you almost allude to the fact that there's a more sinister kind of motivation behind the plant-based movement. So can you just speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use the word sinister.
Okay.
But I would say that the effect can be quite sinister. So I think the way I look at it, and again, I do try to lay this out in the book, is there's nobody pulling strings at the center of this movement. There's nobody coordinating all of the actors and driving them to say and do the same things to push this plant-based agenda to the top. It's more that the plant-based agenda suits many commercial interests so well that they appear to be acting together, and they do support each other. So for instance, the pharmaceutical companies are very well served by the idea that saturated fat is really bad for you. LDL cholesterol, super dangerous. It's driven by saturated fat. Therefore, you've got to control your LDL. Therefore, you probably need statins after a certain age, or maybe even earlier if you're really taking precautions. So that is one arm. That's one way that the whole debate about veganism is linked to pharmaceutical profit. Food companies you alluded to, yes, it's no secret that because saturated fat, which is mostly in animal source foods, is deemed to be, if that can be deemed to be bad for us, gives them a great excuse to produce lots of vegan foods, opening up this whole new market for fake food, but also to use really cheap ingredients like vegetable oils and emulsifiers and all those things instead of the saturated fat containing products. So profits, hey, wow, who wouldn't go for that, right? So they support each other. The media, they then do research which helps to fuel and support that idea. So they're providing all the funding. So the academics have to do the studies that support the ideas where the funding is coming from. So that's why you see a preponderance of epidemiology being anti-meat, anti-animal foods. Right?
You meant, yeah, go on. Were you going to say?
And then the final loop, the final sort of piece of the jigsaw, I guess, or the bit of the circle that links up, is that the media then takes the press releases from these studies, which have been paid for by industry usually. They take those press releases, they don't look at them, they don't look at the study, they don't interrogate anymore. And this is partly because they don't have the staff to do that, because media has been under threat. So and they just parrot the press release and off it goes into the world. And I think somebody said recently, I think it was Mark Twain they were quoting, that said, you know, a lie can be halfway around the world before the truth even has its boots on.
That's so true these days.
Once it's out there, it's pretty hard to get it back, right? So this seems like an irrefutable little circle of interests who are all benefiting from the same thing.
Yeah.
Then you throw in the fact that some media outlets are actually funded by vegan activists to the tune of, you know, The Guardian, it was £2 million over a couple of years that we're probably keeping it afloat at that point, because we know that media outlets struggle to exist. So that is a very direct link, isn't it? So if you've got animal rights activists funding newspapers and in return purchasing a certain set of articles or an amount of coverage which is favorable to animal rights activism, you've got another kind of force that's acting to prop up this seemingly irrefutable case. So it's, you know, and then this is before I even get to talking about the church and how it may be involved. You know, the Seventh
I
Day
love that chapter, by the way. I hope we get to address that. Remind me if I forget.
So, I think a lot of people, they don't understand the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They've never heard of it. There's not a church in their village or their town or whatever where they may have seen it. But the fact is that church has, since its inception, been anti-meat and has wielded its influence through in many ways, through dietitians organizations, through the dietary advice groups, the USDA's advice, dietary guidelines committees, all and right through to founding sort of organizations like ACLM. And it was basically based on the whole plant-based idea to begin with, and it's expanded to be about health in general. But it definitely and it's very tightly linked with that Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, Mayor Adams in New York has appointed somebody very closely affiliated with ACLM to run hospital food choices across hospitals in New York City. So if anyone thinks that church is not influencing what's on our plates, they are naive.
And you know, obviously if you're talking about that chapter, I wasn't going to go here yet, like this is going to be later. No, this is great. I'm going with the flow. This is great. But obviously we can't brush over their story about Mr. Kellogg. So how, as a 12-year-old, basically the reason why the Adventist Church wanted to convert everyone to meat-free is because they believed that going plant-based would kind of cleanse the soul, and, you know, prevent masturbation, and you know, it's kind of
impure thoughts.
So that's basically the root of the, you know, eating plant-based for the Adventist Church. And Mr. Kellogg was a 12-year-old boy, and he was on board with it and doing like an activist almost on their behalf. Is that right?
That's right. Well, what he, as a young boy, 12-year-old, you're right, he was tasked with typing out the manuscripts for Ellen G. White, who was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So he would have been typing this, just imagine, and absorbing all of this information about meat is evil. It leads to all kinds of impure thoughts, masturbation, etc. We must wean people off meat. It must be the Garden of Eden diet, which is
that's right, Garden of Eden diet.
It's very, I mean, what's more religious than that? A diet named Garden of Eden diet. And so he would have absorbed this over a period of years, and then he went on to found, obviously, Kellogg's, and to experiment with producing the first sort of meat analogs, so plant-based meats and cereals and things which would enable people to feed themselves without the risk of becoming, you know, sinful, impure, and whatever.
I find that fascinating that's, you could say that's the origin of our breakfast cereals, you know, to prevent impure thoughts, to prevent masturbation. And, you know, it's mad. Like, that's what made me really, I mean, that's such an attention grabbing part of the book. It's like, oh my gosh. And then you kind of go on, you know, with more, there's more to that story. But I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. But I mean, what I wanted to kind of backtrack to, because you've said a number of really key points. So, I mean, first of all, when you said that, you know, the lies get round really quickly, and then before the truth even gets its boots on. I believe it was Natasha Campbell McBride who said that it takes about 60 years approximately for
Yeah.
a lie to get out there and for it to be absorbed, and then for it to be backtracked. Like, it takes about 60 years for that process to happen. And so obviously, you know, I don't know where we are in that cycle, but anyway, I just thought that was really interesting. But what I did want to ask you about is, you know, so the issue with meat. So we have been encouraged to not eat meat for many decades now, and it started with a scientist called Ansel Keys. Like, he was probably the main one in the 50s who basically linked saturated fat to heart disease. So saturated fat from animals, let's say, and dairy, let's say. And it's really interesting because you said that it's the science that he used to come up with that was similar to the same science that you could say that the number of people who drowned in a pool between 1999 and 2009 is the same number of Nicolas Cage movies. So that's the same science they use. Obviously, Nicolas Cage movies don't cause pool drownings, like there's no correlation there, but it's called the science of epidemiology.
Right.
So can you explain that? What is wrong with the science of epidemiology?
So it's epidemiology is often called observational science. So what you're doing is basically observing patterns in sets of data. So for instance, you could observe that between in a 10-year period, drownings went up in pools, as you say, and so did Nicolas Cage movies, you know, the number of Nicolas Cage movies, and there was a perfect correlation. So, you know, if you were very naive, you might jump to the conclusion that one caused the other.
Yeah.
So that is exactly what is being done with this observational science. So they will look, for instance, at a group of people and conclude that the group who ate more meat, more saturated fat, whatever the factor is that they're actually looking at, had a higher rate of heart disease or cancer or heart attack death or whatever, again, what the end point is. And they will track that and assume there's a connection, assume that one causes the other. What epidemiology is supposed to do is it's supposed to set up a hypothesis that is then tested in trials in RCTs, right, which are clinical controlled situations where you can test whether that hypothesis is true or not. Unfortunately, we're in a state now where those hypotheses are either not tested at all. They're just put out there, that lie that goes around the world in 5 minutes before the boots of the truth come on, or they are tested, and the time and time again, the RCT will prove that the hypothesis was wrong, but nobody hears about those RCTs. They only hear about the original hypothesis. And again, for your listeners, there's a fantastic article just come out by Nina Teicholz, who's the author of The Big Fat Surprise. You may have read this article, which is...
I haven't actually. Explain.
Oh, it's excellent. So she has a Substack, which is really worth subscribing to. She's great in this field. And she's just written a whole analysis of why is it that Harvard and Walter Willett in particular remain attached to this anti-meat bias and the anti-saturated fat bias. And she goes through why. But one of the very interesting points in that article is she points out that there have been, I think it was 24 RCTs, which have disproven the hypothesis of the link between red meat and diabetes. Okay, 24. And yet, Walter Willett's new study comes out and claims that red meat is linked to diabetes. He's doing another observational studies. He's ignoring the RCTs. This is junk science. This is decades worth of junk science. I mean, personally, I think we've reached the point where, whereas you could say that epidemiology has a role, it plays its a role and it has a purpose.
Because sometimes, like, you can't deny the correlation between things. You're like, well, it's
Sometimes,
got to be
no.
that. Like, because
And if you,
sometimes, yeah.
well, with smoking, it proved to
Right.
be the elucidator of the truth, because the people who smoked were 10 to 30 times more likely to get lung cancer or to die, depending on which study you're talking about, than people who didn't. So that is a huge magnitude of effect. We need to remember that most of these epidemiology studies have a magnitude of effect of maybe 1.2, 1.4 at most. Now, there's something called the Bradford Hill criteria, which says that if an effect is not 2 or more, there's probably no causation going on, right? Now, I have yet to see any studies linking meat with a disease or with death that are 2 or more. They don't exist.
Well, then can I just ask then? I mean, the stigma around saturated fat is still so strong.
Yeah.
I mean, even myself, so I love a good steak. Even
Mm.
myself, I'm like, oh, but should I be having it often? Like, I even question myself, even though I've spoken to so many professionals and I've, done some research myself, and I'm just like, no, just have the steak. Like, we've kind of, this is what our ancestors ate, and it's full of nutrients. But even, if even I question it sometimes within myself, like, what do other people have? What chance do they have, the public, when it comes to, eating red meat? Because the stigma is still there, like animal fat, lard, red meat, it's scary for people. Like, why is it still so powerful? Like, why is he going against the
Willett,
real
I'm afraid, as Nina details, Willett has way too much invested in this message, the plant-based, anti-saturated fat, anti-meat message, to ever turn back or admit.
Okay,
His whole
so
career is built
yeah,
on the
right.
funding of the research at his university, Harvard, was decades worth of food companies. He's put a stake in the ground. He's an academic. It would be very unusual for him to say, oh, by the way, I might have been wrong for 35 years, 40 years, right?
Right.
So we mustn't expect him to do that. What would be nice is if the people who are doing other research, who are bringing new research to the fore, did not get persecuted quite so much or ridiculed quite so much. So because we need that balance, so I think that, in answer to your question, why are we still afraid of saturated fat? Probably because we're really still in that 60-year cycle that you're talking about, right? So in the 50s, Ansel Keys planted the idea. It became embedded in policy and thinking and studies and universities and bias and companies. And we're not through it. Maybe it's a 70-year cycle and we're not through it yet.
So are you optimistic? Does that mean you're optimistic about where we're heading?
I'm a little bit optimistic. And I tell you why, because in the past 3 years, there's been just a flood of studies refuting the saturated fat link with heart attacks or with diabetes or whatever. There's been a flood of them. Eventually, that has to have some effect. I also think that I've seen a slight turn amongst people that I speak to, and I'd be interested in your perspective on this, about the whole vegetable oil thing. When I mention that vegetable oils are toxic, that they may be the things that are atherosclerotic, easy for me to say, people don't look at me like I'm completely crazy. So I think something is happening. The word about veg oils is getting out, that they're not really lovely vegetable oils. They're made from an industrial process that compresses seeds. They're seed oils. And chemicals and heat processing is used. The heat processing damages the molecules. So they start off oxidized, then they get more oxidized when you cook them, then they get oxidized in your body, and boom, you have a adverse health impact.
I mean, the seed oil topic, I'm just really interested in, and I just find it absolutely fascinating how it actually came about. I mean, to kind of frame this, one of the issues with plant-based diets is we resort to soy foods and vegetable oils in order to avoid animal-based protein and animal-based fats. So there are a couple of issues there when it comes to the increase in vegetable oils, but then also because soy, the quality of it isn't that great. And you mentioned in your book as well, just it's very commonly a GMO, like a genetically modified food and a genetically modified ingredient that's used in a lot of processed foods out there. So those are the two main issues that I saw you identify in your book. But I mean, when it comes to seed oils, do you know the story? I think, well, what's the brand? Is it CRISPR?
Crisco.
Crisco, that's it.
So
Crisco.
my
Do you know
problem
the
now.
story, the late
Yeah,
1800s? It's bloody fascinating
it
how,
is.
like,
Yeah.
they basically came out in the late 1800s and they sold, I think it was cottonseed oil was the first ever
Obviously.
vegetable oil, and they pushed it out to the US, I think, first, and the public actually rejected it first because they're like, no, like, I'm not going to eat this stuff, like, this is used for
Which was
lamps
used for
and
lubricating machinery.
yes, that's
Yes.
right. And it was rejected, like full on rejected. But then because the marketing was so was so good and there was so much money put into it, that actually the public began to take it on. Like, and it's just crazy how that was the start of vegetable oils. And then obviously the other vegetable oils piled on top of that. And that's how margarine came about, like trans fats, like mixing saturated with seed oils um and the adulteration of olive oils, and it's
Yeah.
just crazy. And I've spoken to a couple of people who are really against seed oils.
Did you speak
And
to Tucker Goodrich by any chance? Yeah.
no,
No.
actually it's Dr. Chris Kenobi and
Oh,
Suzanne
yeah.
Alexander. They're on a trip at the moment around 7 Pacific Islands,
Oh.
actually going around to local tribes and people who basically don't have any vegetable oils in their diet, or very, very
Right.
little. And they're actually investigating their health, like currently they're on the trip at the moment, which is really exciting for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's just absolutely fascinating how the story of vegetable oils. But that's the problem with the plant-based diet. In order to avoid animal-based fats,
Yeah.
the increase in vegetable oils goes up as well. So,
It
like, I
does.
mean, that's a huge problem. And when you say that correlation doesn't exactly mean causation, but sometimes the evidence is so powerfully connected. So, and the rate of disease, of chronic disease, correlates quite strongly with seed oil consumption.
Absolutely. Now, Chris Kenobi, I've seen his charts, and he can correlate many diseases with the rise in vegetable oils. And I know he personally believes it isn't so much the sugar in diets, because that's another kind of thing
That's
that's into
interesting.
your diet
Yeah.
when you're avoiding meat and dairy. He makes a very convincing case. Now, as you say, it is epidemiological at this stage. So I think it's fantastic that they're going into societies, a bit like Weston Price did back in the 1930s.
Correct. Yeah.
Discover what is it that makes these populations healthy or healthier than the populations that eat white bread and vegetable oils, flour, etc. The one thing that is for certain is you can't prove causation with these graphs, with this epidemiology. What you can do is disprove it, though. So I think the burden of proof is much lower if you're just trying to say, no, that can't be it. Because, so for instance, what you can say is that rates of diabetes, for example, or heart disease have gone up, while saturated fat intake since the 1960s has gone down. So you can say it's not plausible for saturated fat to be causing that, right? And that should get you started on these RCTs, which of course, as Nina has pointed out, there have been about 24 of them that have proved that there's no link. So, I do support epidemiology in that sense, if it's pointing us to something that we must investigate. And that's, I guess, what Chris Kenobi is trying to do. Others are doing that. Tucker Goodrich is interesting. He's a self-taught researcher, and he has dug into so many papers about vegetable oils, and he works from the perspective not of epidemiology or looking at trends or population groups. He looks at mechanisms mostly. So he looks at what might it be in vegetable oil that could cause certain diseases, and he finds those mechanisms. And one of them, for instance, that he finds is very prevalent in veg oils is that it turns off the 4-HNE gene.
Okay.
And the 4-HNE gene is an anti-cancer gene. So that's just an example of one of the ways that vegetable oils may, in fact, cause harm. Other work has focused on oxidation and what that does to the parts of the body. So I think you get mechanistic data, and you get RCTs, which actually track biomarkers in different people, and you have the population data, then you have a much more robust kind of understanding of what these foods really do.
So, I mean, I guess what we're trying to say is that meat, animal produce, that is not the cause of cancer. It's not the cause of heart disease. Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm saying.
Okay.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
That's what I get from you very strongly. I mean, we've talked about how nutrients are missing from a plant-based diet, but when it comes to the harm, now this is a really controversial topic. The possible harm that a plant-based diet could do to your health. So you talk about let me try and see how you talk about this threesome. I can't, the troublesome threesome. So you talk about oxalates, phytates, and lectins. So not only can a plant-based diet be deficient, but it can also be harmful if you have too many of these terrible threesome. So there's this really interesting story. I don't know if you've heard it. I think you have, about Liam Hemsworth. About how he went vegan, and he had to cancel, I think in 2019, he had to cancel all of his plans, award ceremonies, because he was rushed to hospital with kidney stones. And he came out publicly saying it was all of those spinach smoothies he had, and it was the vegan diet that he was on. And obviously the outrage and the outpouring of like, are you crazy? Like, that, how did spinach smoothies make you sick? But actually, he was referring to oxalates, which is really interesting. So can you speak a little bit about oxalates, lectins, and phytates? Like, why do plants have these terrible, troublesome threesome?
So plants have these anti-nutrients, we call them, because essentially they're trying to protect themselves. They're trying not to get eaten in nature. And so in the same way that some plants have a bitter taste, and the origin of that would be, don't eat me, don't pick me, or at least don't pick me until I'm ready, till the cycle is through. But what those anti-nutrients do to us, for some people, they don't make any difference at all. Some people can tolerate them in small amounts and they won't feel effects, or they won't connect the effects. Then other people, if they are eating too much of those anti-nutrients, will suffer various impacts in the body. So one of the impacts is that they will be gradually depleting nutritionally, because what those do, phytates and oxalates in particular, they reduce absorption of other minerals in your body. So for instance, with oxalates, it's calcium. With phytates, it'll be zinc and iron, which are impacted. So you won't get as much, and therefore you think you're eating well, but because it's not being absorbed, you won't be eating well. So there's that nutrient deficiency which could arise. And this is, by the way, why the WHO, if you read the fine print of any of their papers, they recommend that in countries where grain and wheat is the staple of the diet and not much meat is eaten, the recommended daily intake of zinc is 1.7 times what it is in a country where you can have meat, where you eat meat.
And there's that fine print you were talking about. That's an
acknowledgement of the fact that you're not going to get all the zinc because of the wheat and the grains, so you better eat more in order to absorb enough. So that's one thing. But then the other impact is the one you alluded to about Liam Hemsworth, which is the excess can actually cause other things to happen, like kidney stones, like digestive distress, like arthritis in the joints, ankles being a particular one. And again, Sally Norton has pioneered a lot of work in this field and has written a great book called Toxic Superfoods about just how this happens in the body. So, and it's not very difficult to understand, because most doctors for normal people would recommend about 100 milligrams of oxalates a day in your diet. If you're having a spinach smoothie with, say, 3 cups of spinach, you're getting 1,000 in one smoothie.
Yeah.
It's not hard to see. And then you throw almonds in there. Almonds are also very high in oxalates.
Yeah.
And then maybe some sweet potatoes, they're also very high. So you can quickly see those 3 foods are going to be a staple of a vegan diet, aren't they?
And
for a lot of
and considered superfoods as well. Yeah.
And a lot of people will poo-poo this idea, and they will not have seen evidence of it. And one of the reasons, I think, is that doctors are not trained to look out for it. I think it'd be very unusual to go to a doctor and say, "Doctor, I'm having terrible gastric distress, and I have pain in my ankles, and pain in my kidneys." And what might that be? I don't know that many doctors would be clued up enough to say, let's investigate your oxalate intake.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I love this topic because people will poo-poo this idea. They will say this is absolute rubbish. And I'll admit, even myself, I was just like, really though, really, like spinach, like, with all of those problem foods out there, spinach, like really, can I take this on right now? Like, it's a lot. And I actually interviewed Sally Norton, and it was an absolutely fabulous interview, and she just really dove into it. And what became clear to me was that was actually one of the episodes that brought on a lot of opinions, like a lot of naysayers and a lot of people supporting it as well. Because and what became really clear to me is, unless you've been through it, it's very tempting to poo-poo it. But the people who were supporting the episode, they were so heartfelt, and they were like, honestly, you have no idea how bad the oxalates, this happened to me. Yeah, like this, you have no idea, like the pain I was in, and how much it changed my life taking oxalates out. Like, so it became very clear to me that unless you've experienced it yourself, it's very easy to be like, oh, spinach, like what's the harm? But do you think these troublesome threesome, do you think they're a problem for everybody? Like, will everyone have joint pain because of spinach? Or do you think
I don't.
dose issue, or do you think there's a genetic component there? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know what Sally would say, but I think it has to be true that there's a different propensity depending on your genetic makeup and depending on what foods you were raised on and how much you've had through your lifetime and all of those things.
Right.
And for some people, it may be perfectly okay to have a cupful of spinach a day and a sweet potato every night for dinner and that kind of thing. But for others, it isn't. And I think to be clued into the information to look for signals in our body. And we also have to acknowledge that certain diets will give you more of propensity than others. So if you're replacing meat, eggs, and dairy with these other foods, these so-called superfoods, you are more likely to have an overload. Now, I think part of the problem is our unwillingness to look, as you've said. I sort of a young woman known to me who I had lunch with maybe 6 months ago, with her family, who are also some of them vegetarian. She's a vegan. She's had ME for 6 years. She couldn't get out of bed at one point. She still can't really, and she finds it very difficult. She has very low energy and lots of pain. And I wanted to say to her, do you even ever consider that this might be a result of your vegan diet? Now, I don't know which result, whether it's the lack of nutrients, whether it's the overload of oxalates and phytates. I don't know which aspect is the thing that's giving her the distress, but I would bet quite a large amount of money that if she gave up her vegan diet, she would find her symptoms reduced or went away.
Did you mention it, or did
No,
you hold
I
back?
did not,
Yeah. Because
because
unless
it was
someone
a
asks, you don't want to.
social
Yeah.
situation, and I didn't want to get on the
Yes,
wrong
I
side of either
agree.
her or her mother. If she ever came to me, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I
You
agree.
see, to come to me or to come to anyone,
Mm,
you have to have opened up your mind to this possibility.
mm,
And I don't know quite what does that.
yeah.
Just don't know what makes some people experience extreme ill health and say, okay, I'm going to change my diet because it must have something to do with it.
Mm,
And other people will go on for years and never think about doing that.
yeah.
It's quite
It's a
amazing.
tricky, yeah, it's very tricky, like, because you want to be aware that you don't want to push your
Mm,
you don't want to push yourself and your views onto someone who's not asking for it.
mm,
But I can imagine inside, like, you're thinking, gosh, I wonder if that is it. Like, I can imagine what that
yeah,
feeling was like for you. It's like, oh God, I wonder if I should say something or not. But then you're just like, no, and I agree, I probably would have been the same. But I just find the plant food, the troublesome threesome, as you say, I just find it really fascinating. And I think that might take some time for people to grasp it. When it comes to just, I mean, it's a big topic when it comes to climate change. And
yeah,
do you think we are victims of what you refer to as errant thinking, Dr. Kendrick?
yeah,
Errant
yeah, yeah.
thinking. So, what
Yeah.
is this term, and are we victims of it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the way he describes errant thinking is, oh my goodness, we have a problem.
Mm,
We need a solution right away, and we've got to be able to implement it. Oh gosh, cows, they produce methane. That must be the solution.
mm,
We've got to get rid of the cows, right? So I think I've paraphrased there, but that would be, I think, what he would say is happening, and that definitely is happening. So
like a
these
quick fix solution, like quickly get
quick
in
fix
there, make a
solutions.
change,
So
and then run with it.
the
Yeah.
calls for the culling of 30% of the cattle herd in Ireland
Mm,
are a pure and simple attempt to get Ireland's carbon budget back to even, or to meet its carbon net zero targets, that every country has net zero targets. So the quick fix is get rid of the cows, no more methane from them. But there are just dozens of repercussions from that kind of quick fix errant thinking, which is, I mean, let's start with, if you get rid of the cows in Ireland, they export most of their beef anyway. So some other people, countries are going to get that beef from somewhere else. It might be from somewhere with a bigger carbon footprint, where forest is being cut down for
mm,
soy plantations to feed cattle or for the cattle themselves, right? So by eradicating the cattle that is grown mostly on pasture in Ireland, where, by the way, nothing else is really done because that's what Ireland is suited for, their land is suited for that, you're then creating, so you're popping it down here and it'll pop up somewhere else, right? The other thing which is errant is it fails to take into account things other than the carbon footprint,
mm.
which are very important. Biodiversity, soil health. How do you build soil health without animals on the land?
Right, because
Which
you need them, right, to kind of
nurturing
actually
grassland. Yeah,
like till and like get the
yes,
microbes and
yeah, exactly. It doesn't take into account farmer livelihoods and communities
mm,
and economic integrity. Countries have to do what they can do. What they have to profit from the industries that they can have in their
mm,
countries. So all of these things are being downplayed, and just because we have carbon tunnel vision.
mm,
And the other thing which is happening is nobody's talking about the other sources of methane. So methane comes from a wide variety of things, natural and unnatural, natural and man-made, including industry, right? Including wetlands, including oceans, including landfill. And by going for this quick, easy fix of get rid of the cattle, we're ignoring all of those other things. So methane from cattle is only about 15% of the total carbon budget, right? That's not very much.
mm,
And it has been acknowledged by the IPCC in its 6th assessment that we are already overstating the warming impact of methane from cattle by about 3 to 4 times, and understating the warming impact of methane from other sources like industry. So this is more than just sad for farmers, sad for Ireland, sad for cows, right? It is about, it's pushing us down a route which will not fix the problem and will create other problems. So yes, you'll get your, you'll be a little step closer to the mathematical meeting of targets, but it's all going to come unstuck in a few years' time because of what we're not doing, right?
Right. And also, you mentioned animal cruelty, which, I mean, first of all, anybody who says that what would you say to someone who is avoiding meat because of animal cruelty? Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say I understand that. And I understand the visceral reaction, which is, I do not want to eat a chicken which has been housed with a million other chickens.
Yeah.
In really inhumane conditions, or I don't want to eat meat from a feedlot where the cow doesn't move and it's fed lots of grains and it's uncomfortable and it's full of antibiotics. And so I do understand that. So I would be putting all of my energy into more humane conditions for raising animal sourced foods
rather than them getting rid of the animals altogether.
And I know that that's not easy, and I know that that is not it's not quick, but I think it's laudable. And I would really love to see universities doing that. So what I find distressing is that we recently had in this country a letter signed by 600 university academics calling for meat-free, actually vegan meals on campuses in the cafeterias. And what I really would love for them to do is do something like, they are going to source only meat from certain types of farms, meat from regenerative sources. They're going to seek always to have the highest welfare, highest ecologically sound standards possible for the food they serve in their cafeterias. If that means there's a little less meat because and the servings have to be smaller because there is less of that kind of product around, or because it's more expensive at the moment, so be it. That to me is a more intelligent way of leading the thinking on this, instead of this very knee-jerk virtue signaling attempt to get people to just get rid of meat altogether, and eggs and fish. And then you have the kind of the criminality element of it, which Dr. Mason would say, and by I use that word loosely. Is it right? Is it just to ask young women of childbearing age who are most at risk from nutrient deficiencies at this period of their lives, is it right to ask them to do without animal source foods? At what point does that become immoral? Because even Eat Lancet, which is the organization that you may know about, who's pushing for the plant-based diet around the world, and for the past 5 years has been doing so. In its original report, even they said that their diet, which is about half an ounce of meat a day, it's so nearly vegan, and it really downplays the importance of dairy and eggs and any animal foods. Even they admit that that diet is not suitable for babies, children, toddlers, teenagers, young women of childbearing age, pregnant women, ill people, old people. So this is, again, the fine print. And I just do not understand how anyone can hold up that diet as the best diet if that is true. It's not right. It is immoral to do that.
Yeah.
So we have morality to do with the way we treat animals. We also have morality to do with what we do to the next generation of young women, young men, children who need these foods.
Yeah, and that's what we gloss over. That's what is glossed over, the effect that the plant-based diet could have on future generations. And also just how, the plant-based diet isn't necessarily innocent when it comes to animal cruelty.
It's not, it's right.
I mean, when I interviewed Zoe Harcum, she put up a slide about the fields that have been kind of cut down, like for all the plants and the grains, and she basically listed all of the animals that would have died in that process. And she's like, well, what's more important, a rabbit, a cow? Like, what was the comparison here? So, I think in summary, I think the plant-based diet is just way too like shooting from the hip. Like, it's too quick to judge the situation on the planet. And also there are just some higher powers that have some other invested interests that aren't necessarily focused on our health or the environment, like, which is what they say. So, I mean, I wouldn't judge anyone for eating, for avoiding meat for their own reasons, but I think I agree with you. It's the plant-based advocates, the ones who are pushing plant-based diets onto us. That's what this is all about. That's who this is aimed at. So I think it's really well said. And once again, the book is absolutely incredible, and I would just recommend it to anybody who is looking for a book like this. So this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much, Jayne. Is there anything that you want to say to finish? And what is the best way for people to get hold of you after this? Well, you don't necessarily want everyone to get hold of you, like you said at the beginning. Don't come to me with your comments. But how can people
comments and constructive comments?
Yeah, constructive comments are welcome. Yeah.
So people can direct message me on Twitter. I'm at Jayne Buxton. It's very easy to find. And that's probably the best way. I don't put my email address on my website because it's too easy for people to send abuse. So I'm sorry if that's difficult for people, but I am willing to engage, and anyone who wants to, I will definitely do that.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Jayne. This was a fabulous conversation, and I hope we get to do this again soon.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it very much.